This lesson focuses specifically on hardware and software for recording audio. I have created a separate lesson that comes next to cover video recording hardware and software, but there is a lot of overlap between the two. If you're only doing an audio-only podcast, I recommend watching this lesson and then skipping the next one unless you just want to watch it for fun because it sounds fun. It is a fun lesson. If you're doing a video podcast, then I recommend taking the time to go through both lessons since you'll likely be working with audio and video hardware, and knowing the ins and outs of each will be really helpful. Now, when it comes to the basics of recording audio, believe it or not, you're going to need something that can record audio. Very hard to believe, I know. That is either going to take the form of a software application or a piece of physical hardware, and we're going to go through both right now in this lesson, starting with software. If you're going to be recording your podcast directly into a software application, you do have quite a few options. I'm using a Mac right now, but I'll give you some options that also work on PCs as well. As I've said before, and a few other things that we've talked about, there are almost limitless options with what you have available to you in terms of software applications for recording. So I'm just going to give you a few of maybe the most popular ones or the ones that I recommend the most. If you're on a Mac, the simplest option is actually just QuickTime. So if you open up QuickTime, click on File, and then do a new audio recording, you can select your audio source, press record, and you're good to go. This is pretty much the equivalent, if you're on a Windows computer, of Sound Recorder. So just a basic application that just records whatever you ask it to, and it doesn't really give you any other feedback, any other controls. When you're done, you press stop, and then you have your file. And once you're done recording, you can do whatever you want with that file. You can upload it directly, and that can be your podcast, but there's a good chance you'll probably need to do a little bit of editing and fine-tuning, and so then you can put that into any editing application that you want to. Now, the other free option that comes on a Mac is GarageBand, which is actually pretty amazing software. It's really geared more towards music, but it can also work really well for spoken word, and it has gotten incredibly capable over the years. Once you open up GarageBand, you can just create a new project. In this case, I'm going to choose a mic or line audio and then click create. By default right now, this is just using my computer's built-in microphone, but if I go up into GarageBand and click on settings, I can go to the audio menu. So in this case, I will choose the Rodecaster Pro 2 that I'm using as both my input and my output. And then I can press record, and now I'm recording over here. But there are a few things to sort of be aware of when it comes to recording in GarageBand. Now, like I just mentioned, GarageBand is really geared towards music. So what I would recommend doing is coming up here to the display, and instead of beats and project, which is the default, you can go down and choose time. And then it's just going to tell you how long you're recording. The other thing you want to do is turn off the metronome. If you don't turn off the metronome, you're going to hear the click, click, click throughout your actual recording. And there's not really going to be a way to get rid of that. Ask me how I know. That's a frustrating thing to accidentally do. There is also this option here to do a 1, 2, 3, 4 count in. You can leave that on or off. That just means that when you start recording, it's not going to start immediately. It's going to count in 1, 2, 3, 4 and then start recording. So that's just up to you if you want to have like a little bit of a lead in to when you start recording, or you just want to start right away. And once you're all set, then you just press record. And here I have the count in going. And so boom, now it's recording, and you can see it's recording because my voice is going up and down, and there we go. And when I'm done, I can just press stop. And now I have my audio file right here. So once you have your finished podcast, which is going to look a bit longer than just these 2 random bits of audio that I have here, you can then go up to share and you can export the song to disk. That's where you can give your podcast a name, and you can also choose how you want to export it. Either WAV or AAC is what I would recommend. We'll kind of get into this more in the editing portion, but WAV is pretty good. You can export it to your computer, and then you will have your finished file ready to upload. But again, we'll talk more about that specifically in the editing. That's just kind of a rundown of GarageBand. That same basic process is pretty much how every audio recording application works. Now, the biggest limiting factor to recording in GarageBand might seem kind of silly at first, and it might not matter to you, but as time goes on, it might actually really matter to you. And that is the broadcast meters, the levels up here. So if I play this audio file, you can see that it is recording. Everything's in the green. I'm kind of going up into the yellow maybe a little bit, but I'm not going into the red, and things are looking pretty good there. What you'll notice though is that there are no numbers on these volume meters. There's no way for me to know where I'm at. Am I at that -16 that I mentioned earlier? Am I higher or lower than that? There's no way to know, and literally there's just not the option in GarageBand at all. The only way to get around that is right here, which looks a lot like GarageBand, except this is actually an entirely different application. This is called Logic. And so logically, you might think that some very fundamental features like broadcast meter levels would be in GarageBand, but they are not. If you need those meters and those levels, you have to go into Logic, and then down here you see a much more traditional mixer sort of interface, and you can see the levels right there, which are very, very precise. Logic is Apple's professional audio editing software, so it's kind of the same thing if you're familiar with video editing and you know iMovie is like the beginner editing app and Final Cut Pro is the higher end one. It's sort of the same thing. GarageBand is the beginner one, and then Logic Pro is the pro one. There are also more features in Logic Pro than just the broadcast meters, but if you're in GarageBand and you're looking for that and you're kind of wondering where it is and it's something you really want while you're recording, that's the way to get it on Apple-based software. Now, I do just want to give you a couple more audio editing and recording application recommendations that also work on Windows. So the next two will work on both Mac and Windows. The first one is a free option called Audacity. Believe it or not, I do have the audacity to recommend Audacity. And this is something you can download, again, to either your Windows or your Mac computer. And even though it is free, Audacity is a very full-featured application. You can see right on their website, they specifically talk about podcasters and podcast editing. That is one of the main things that it's geared towards, in addition to music and any other kind of audio editing. And the last piece of software that I want to highlight right now is actually my favorite audio editing application for podcasts, and that is Adobe Audition. I just really like the way that Audition works. So right now you can kind of see me recording in here. I have multi-tracks if I need multiple tracks. If I do simple things like I cut this track right here, and then I need to bring something together, like let's say I want to trim this out and bring this together, see how it just automatically fades the tracks between them. I can very easily sort of adjust my levels. I can add all kinds of effects, all kinds of processing really easily. Has really good noise reduction. You can play with music in fun ways and like mix songs so that they're the exact length that you need them. I actually really love Adobe Audition. If you don't have an Adobe account, I personally don't recommend getting one just for the sake of Audition, because the Adobe subscription service is one of my least favorite things on planet Earth. But if you're already in the Adobe ecosystem, you've got Photoshop, maybe you've got Premiere or something like that, you might already have Audition available to you. And if that's the case, it's something I really do encourage you to check out for podcast editing, because it's a really streamlined audio editing application. For some reason, when it comes to spoken word, there's something about Audition that, at least for me, just clicks in a way that makes it really easy to use and really fast. And especially if you're working with multiple tracks and multiple people, it's just been really fun. Like, I genuinely enjoy editing in Adobe Audition. But same goes for the other applications too. GarageBand, Logic, Audacity. You can have a lot of fun and you can get a lot of really quality results from any of those applications. Just keep in mind that any audio editing application is going to have a learning curve. They all kind of do the same things, but they do them slightly differently, and commands might be called different things. So whatever you're choosing to use, it's going to take, a few episodes, a few repetitions before you start to really feel comfortable with it. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the editing section, but everything that I'm going to share in that section about editing will work in any application. It's all the basic cut, trim, fade, mix kind of options that you can do in any application. So just use the one that you feel more comfortable with, or the one that's most accessible to you, and you will be totally fine. The important thing to keep in mind right now, and why I'm sharing all this right now, is if you are recording your podcast into a software application, you need to know which software application you're going to use, and I just wanted to share some options with you. And the last thing I do want to point out as we're talking about audio podcast software is sometimes people ask me if they're already familiar with video editing. They use Final Cut or iMovie or Resolve or Premiere or whatever. Can they just edit their audio-only podcast in their video editor of choice? Sometimes people feel like, is that an okay thing to do because I'm only editing audio and it's a video editing application? I think if you were to go to audio engineering school, the answer would be no. You should use audio for audio applications. But honestly, I'm of the school of thought that if it works, it works. And if you're really fast and familiar and comfortable with some sort of video editing application, even if you're doing an audio-only podcast, there's nothing wrong with just editing your audio in there and then exporting it as an audio-only file. Even though there are those best practices when it comes to things like audio podcast production, at the same time, this is a very DIY method. You are in charge of everything at every level, and again, if it works, it works. Because think about what's most important here. Do you just want to follow every best practice for the sake of following every best practice and checking off boxes? Realistically, nobody's going to notice that. Or is it more important to just produce your podcast and share it with the world? Now, the other option when it comes to recording audio, if you're not going to use software, would be to use hardware. And that can be anything as simple as this little tiny handheld recorder right here, all the way to the much more advanced Rodecaster Pro 2 that I'm using here, to a full-on audio production studio. Really, the sky is the limit if you want to get into the world of audio hardware, but it does not have to be complicated, and it actually doesn't have to even be very expensive either. Like I mentioned, this little recorder right here, the Zoom H1e, is about $100, and it has even built-in microphones, so you can just use this as your complete recorder, and it also even has a 3.5 millimeter microphone input. So you can connect simple, small little microphones right here. There are even other options, like this is sort of a bigger version of that one that has a built-in microphone, but it also has 2 XLR ports. So you can connect 2 XLR microphones right here. And there are other versions of things like that. This is a very similar thing, but it doesn't have its own mic, so it's just for recording XLR. So when it comes to audio recording hardware, little recorders like this are really the most simple. These can all be had for under $200, some of them significantly under $200. Now, the more advanced options like the Rodecaster Pro I'm using here can just do a lot more. This one specifically has 4 XLR inputs. It also has wireless receivers, so if I use certain Rode wireless microphones, I can connect those here. I can bring in other sources from like USB. I can route outputs to different things, so I can do different mixes for everybody's headphones, different mixes for different computers, different inputs for different things. The versatility is kind of crazy. I can load sound effects and audio effects into these sound pads right here. I have pages of these that I can cycle through and go through different ones. I can also then use this to just process my audio on the spot, which I've kind of mentioned before. Like, I just turned off the processing that I had on this microphone. I've been adding compression and equalizers and de-essers, and that's what then makes this microphone sound already processed. I don't have to do anything when I'm editing this video. The audio is already finished and processed. So the same could be true for your podcast as well. And there is a simple editing workflow, which I've actually included a bonus lesson for, where you can use this to just produce a whole podcast on the fly. I just press record, play my intro music, bring in my audio, whether it's me or me and a couple other people. I can even mix in other sounds, play my outro audio, stop recording, and I'm done. So as soon as I press stop recording, the podcast is finished. And those kinds of no editing workflows do take a bit of practice and a bit of time, but they can be incredibly time effective and really make things sustainable if you're trying to fit your podcast just in the rest of a busy life and a busy world. So that's the kind of thing you can do with something like a Rodecaster Pro. There are smaller versions that only have 2 XLR inputs instead of 4. The good news is that it still has all the same processing power. And the same is true for some other competing products that have like 4 XLR versions or 2 XLR versions. The internal processing and all of that power is exactly the same. So it just comes down to how many microphones you think you want to connect regularly. A very key thing to keep in mind here is that in the Audio Essentials section, we did talk about interfaces. The Rodecaster Pro is technically an interface, but these simple interfaces like this Focusrite Scarlett, these do not have a way to record. So even though you're using your microphone hardware plugged into this piece of hardware, this still needs to go into your computer and to be recorded with software. The advantage to something like a Rodecaster is that you can do all of the recording internally. And you don't have to do that on the fly. You can edit all that audio afterwards. You can record all your tracks separately. I do like those unedited workflows when you can kind of really get into the flow of things, but I don't know that I would 100% recommend that right away when you're starting. I like to bring it up because it's something that, at least for me, made podcasting way more sustainable back when I was just starting out, and I was trying to add that on top of my YouTube channel, on top of my full-time job. I really wanted to start a podcast, but it wouldn't have been possible if I had to spend hours and hours editing every single episode. So being able to record directly in here and everything mixed and ready to go as soon as I was done is actually what made it possible for me to begin podcasting and to keep podcasting in the first place. So sometimes the hardware and the workflow that you put together really can make a difference in terms of functionality and sustainability for your podcast. Now, as we're talking about hardware, I do want to go back to something I talked about in the mic selection lesson, which was gain levels. So I want to go into a little bit more detail there, because whenever you're using an XLR mixer or an interface, it's important to know how much gain your interface has. If you're using a USB microphone connected to your computer, you don't have to worry, USB provides enough power. But as we're talking about hardware, you're connecting your microphone to a piece of hardware. That hardware has internal gain, which is like how loud, how much level your microphone has in that piece of hardware, and not every piece of hardware is created equally. Sometimes you might find a recorder or an interface that just does not have enough gain to power your microphone. If you remember talking about condenser microphones, I said that these require phantom power in order to work. Every interface, every mixer will provide phantom power, so that's no problem. And the good news is, because the microphone's getting that power, it doesn't need as much gain. I mentioned that I'm only using 29 or 30 decibels of gain for this microphone right here. This Rodecaster Pro 2 has 76 decibels of available gain. I'm only using 29 out of 76. Other interfaces like this Focusrite, I forget the exact number, but I think this only has about 50 decibels of gain. So that means if I'm using something like the Shure SM7B, which really requires around 55, 56 decibels to start sounding its best, but my interface only has like 50 decibels or maybe even maxes out at 55, which is a pretty common number, what am I going to do? That is where mic boosters come into play, and these boost the signal of your microphone. So these kind of range in price, surprise, surprise. Some of them, this is called the Clark Technic CT1, Clark spelled with a K. Of course, put links to equipment in all of the lesson descriptions as necessary. What these basically do is they run on phantom power and they introduce more gain into your signal, usually about 25 to 30 decibels of clean gain. So sometimes if you just boost the gain on something, it'll start getting very noisy and very hissy. These will give you clean gain, so it's not going to introduce noise or hiss. And basically what you can do, the Clark Technic is nice and cheap. This can either connect directly to your microphone, or you can run an XLR cable into it and then another XLR cable into your mixer interface. And then this is going to boost the level of your microphone, which basically means now I'm only going to need to run my Rodecaster instead of maybe 55 decibels to do this. I'll only need maybe 30 in order to get this to work. So if I'm using an interface that doesn't have a lot of built-in gain, this just adds gain to that interface. There's a whole variety of mic boosters. There's ones like this. This is called a FET head. It's very similar to the other one I just showed you, except it's a little more expensive. It's closer to $100. I actually like this one because it can connect directly to your microphone, or it can actually connect directly to your interface. And that means you don't need a second XLR cable. Depending on your setup, sometimes when you're using boosters, especially other ones like cloud lifters, some of them even almost look like interfaces themselves. You plug two cables in and then two cables have to go out. I just like introducing the least number of potential failure points as possible into my setup. So being able to connect a booster directly to an interface and then an XLR cable into that, I have found to be the most efficient thing. So I really do like the FET head. It is a little more expensive though. So things like that Clark Technic CT1 being usually around $35 to $40 can really, really help, because you do need a booster for every microphone. So each channel would need its own booster. If you're using 4 SM7Bs, you're going to need 4 boosters. If every booster is $100, now you've just essentially bought another SM7B. But here's a really nice bit of good news, which is that over the past couple of years, pretty much every new decent interface that has been introduced to the market has at least 70 decibels of clean gain. If you're using an interface or a mixer that has at least 70 decibels of gain, you will not need to worry about a booster at all. It will have more than enough power to handle any microphone that you throw at it. Although, don't actually throw microphones at your equipment. So that gain level is a very important specification to look for when you're buying an interface or a mixer. Like I said, most new ones kind of got you covered there, so you just need to double check. If you're using an older interface or something you already have or something that was handed down to you, that's where you might need to look at some of the tech specs, see if there's enough gain, and if not, then you might have to invest in a booster if you're using a dynamic microphone. You never need a booster with a condenser microphone. Keep that in mind. And finally, you might also see some newer recording hardware with a feature called 32-bit float audio. This is something this little Zoom recorder has. This has become very, very popular in recent years, and it can be really, really helpful. If you see 32-bit float advertised on whatever device you're using, that basically means that you're going to be able to recover audio that's either too quiet or too loud without losing quality. So normally, if your audio is too loud and it starts clipping, which basically means your audio waveforms, the tops look like they're clipped off, like someone just took scissors and clipped them off, you can't get that information back. So if you make it quieter, it doesn't matter because the audio has been clipped off. With 32-bit float, there's so much dynamic range between lows and highs that even if your audio waveforms look like they're going out of range, you can turn it down and it will actually recover that without clipping and without sounding, bad or distorted or anything. And the same is true for audio that's too low. Normally, if you have really quiet audio and you try to boost it, you're going to get a lot of noise and hiss. But with 32-bit float, if you accidentally record something that's a little too quiet, you can boost it and it's not going to have that problem. So you can really level things out pretty easily. Some recorders like this one, they don't even give me gain controls. It's just, I record what I record and then I just adjust the levels in my editing software. Other microphones, other recorders that have 32-bit float, they let you either turn it on or turn it off, and they still give you some gain control. Ideally, you want to still get things right because that's going to give you still the overall best sound quality. But with 32-bit float becoming more accessible, there's even recorders like this that do XLR inputs that have 32-bit float built into them. it really is something that can give you a lot of peace of mind, especially if you're, kind of doing things in a rush, you're doing things on the fly. Maybe you're doing a podcast in a remote location and there's a lot to keep in mind. Knowing that as long as you've pressed record, your audio is going to be usable does really give you a lot of peace of mind. So even though things like 32-bit float are really excellent, I do still recommend that you take the time to get things sounding and set up as good as possible so you're working with the highest quality of audio as possible. And then if you need something like the advantages of 32-bit float while you're editing, they're there to help you, but it's not a crutch that you're relying on. And so without getting into the weeds too much with 32-bit float, just know that if you've recorded something in 32-bit on a recorder and you want to put that into editing software, just make sure that your software application lets you create 32-bit float files. Usually when you're starting and you're creating a new project, you can select different specifications for that project. I know like in Adobe Audition, I can very easily select 32-bit float, and then I will get the full advantage of 32-bit float. And finally, to wrap up this section on audio recording hardware, I do just want to re-emphasize that it is possible to combine recording hardware and software. For example, I can select, like you saw, the Rodecaster Pro in my editing software, my recording software over there. And that means I can actually record in both places at once. I can record in the Rodecaster and I can record in the computer. So that redundancy is nice and give me a lot of peace of mind. Maybe not always necessary, but things like that can be a really smart idea when you're doing interviews or events or something that there's no way you'll ever be able to re-record it or replace it if something goes wrong with your audio. So when you're doing a podcast, sometimes it is kind of like being an astronaut. You're planning for every possible failure and then coming up with a solution in advance to counteract it. Because, of course, being a podcaster is very much like being an astronaut in a lot of ways. They're basically the same job. And just be aware that every bit of audio recording hardware is a little bit different. They are a little unique, just like you and me. So make sure you take the time to know the specifications, the limitations, and the capabilities of whatever it is that you're using specifically. How many inputs does it have? Does it have built-in microphones? Are you going to use that built-in microphone? Does it have no built-in microphones? Does it have 32-bit float? All of those things should be taken into account before you invest your money into that piece of equipment. Lots of things look really cool and you go to the store, you browse online, you're like, that looks awesome, this is a good price. But then you kind of realize maybe the internals aren't exactly what you need. Everything is a little bit unique and some things offer things that other things don't have. And last but not least, most audio recorders, pretty much everyone that I have here, has some sort of headphone output to let you monitor your audio, which I always recommend. Be sure, again, to connect your headphones directly to your audio interface or your recorder and not to your computer to avoid latency. If you're running an interface or USB microphone into your computer and you connect your headphones directly to your computer, the signal has to go from the microphone, get processed in the computer, and sent back out. And that means you're going to have that slight delay, that slight latency that we talked about in a previous lesson. It is very hard, if not near impossible, to record while you hear yourself slightly delayed. It just completely breaks your brain. So if you connect your headphones directly to your interface, directly to your recorder, then you're going to hear a zero latency monitoring signal. And that's just going to make sure you know exactly how things are sounding and make sure that you get the best quality audio possible. So I know that was a lot, but those are the basics of audio recording hardware and software. So if you're creating a video podcast, jump straight to the next lesson where we're going to talk about even more specialized software and hardware. And if you're creating an audio only podcast, it's up to you if you want to skip that lesson and jump to the one after that. You can just, if you enjoy spending time with me, I appreciate that. And I'll see you in whichever lesson you choose next.